get out of today is that this is an oil and gas perspective into CCUS, and I'm going to take us into a 40,000 foot level view and dive a little bit deeper into each part of CCUS. This is not by no means this is a technical presentation. It's very much an informational and educational presentation for you guys to get an understanding of what goes into a CCUS project and what the recent market trends are specifically for North America. So yeah, let me go through a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, I'll introduce myself, talk a little bit about what I do at Baker Hughes, and then introduce Baker Hughes as well, if you guys are not familiar. Then we'll go into why we're talking about CCUS, why we need it, why the recent attention into this industry. Then we'll go into each piece of the operational chain. Luckily, CCUS is an acronym of each piece of the value chain. So we'll go into capture, transportation, utilization, and sequestration or storage. Then I'll touch on what Baker Hughes is doing in CCUS. And then I'll bring it back home and talk a little bit about the North America market, specifically focused in the US. And kind of compare it with the rest of the activity in the world. And I'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions. So I'll try to have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So make sure you write them down. So I'm Valeria Di Filippo. I am the Global CCUS Advisor for Reservoir Technical Services at Baker Hughes. I went to school at the University of Tulsa and got my undergrad in petroleum engineering. And then I got my master's at NC State in engineering. I started my career in oil and gas in the Edison Engineering Development Program right around the time when it merged with Baker Hughes. And then I've had various roles, including reservoir engineering, the design, data analytics, market intelligence, etc. But about the last 4 years, I've been involved in the energy transition space. A little bit about Baker Hughes, if you're not familiar, you may be familiar with our legacy oil field role. We're divided into 2 business units. One is that legacy Baker Hughes traditional oil and gas business that you're familiar with, including production solutions, which is artificial lift and downstream chemicals, well construction, well completions, oil field optimization, and then the new energy space, energy transition space. And our other side of the coin, our other business unit is industrial and energy technology, which is our legacy turbo machinery kind of portfolio that we inherited from our merge with GE. And this includes compression technology, turbine technology, as well as a climate technology unit, which is where our energy transition equipment is based. And we've invested in carbon capture technology, carbon direct air capture technology, various hydrogen investments, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But that's pretty much an overview. And where I sit, like I said, I sit in the oil field services and equipment side with a focus in energy transition. So as we know, under the Paris Agreement, in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we must reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions to keep the global average temperature below 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 degrees C below pre-industrial levels. And the IEA has forecasted that in order to meet those goals, we need an array of solutions. So alongside electrification, hydrogen, and sustainable energy, energy efficiency, etc., CCUS will be needed, and it will play a major role because fossil fuels are not going away. We're going to be dependent on them for many decades to come. So It's the only group, CCUS is the only group of technologies that contributes both to reducing emissions in key sectors and in removing these emissions to balance those that cannot be avoided. So it's critical to meet net zero goals. Today, there's about 1 gigaton of CO2 in plant capacity to capture and store. But not all of those projects are going to go ahead. If you look, we have a long way to go to get the scale that we need to meet these goals. So how do we meet this sustainable development scenario from the IEA and the Paris Agreement? Today, we're injecting about 48 million tons of CO2 per year. In 2050, we'll need to be injecting about 4 gigatons per year. That's about 100 times more than we're injecting today, or the equivalent of taking 1 billion cars off the road. So to achieve this goal, we need to, it will require significant investment into more capture facilities, about 2,000 capture facilities, building the pipeline infrastructure that is needed to support the transportation of CO2 to the storage site, about 400 storage sites, and that is over 10,000 wells that need to be drilled to store the CO2. And it's not up to one company, it's not up to one country. It's a collaborative effort, and we've never seen this kind of collaboration before. So it takes everyone to get to this scale. So what are some of the benefits of CCUS exactly? So it's kind of a four-prong approach. This is retrofittable technology, so it applies to both greenfield and brownfield industries. You don't need to build a new coal-fired power plant, or well, you can't, gas-fired power plant in order to have CCUS. You can kind of put a capture unit into what you already have, and kind of had like a low carbon power generation facility. So that applies for existing power and industrial plants, and it can prevent over 600 billion tons of CO2 from being emitted over the next 50 years. So it's pretty critical. It also enables blue hydrogen production. So blue hydrogen has been identified as one of the a new source of power, and when it's combusted, when it's burned, it produces water. So it's actually a net zero power source. About 40% of low carbon hydrogen will come from fossil fuel production paired with CCUS. And what this means is, even though hydrogen is the most abundant element on Earth, it is not, it's not found by itself in nature. You have to remove it or separate it from existing compounds, just like methane or water. So, but those processes are carbon intensive. So pairing CCUS with hydrogen production will actually produce blue hydrogen, which is net zero hydrogen. It's one of the only solutions for heavy industries, cement, iron and steel, pulp and paper. Some of these processes are inherently carbon intensive, and even by switching some of the heat generation and including renewables, some of these processes will require CCUS in order to decarbonize. And lastly, CO2 removal. This is direct air capture, direct ocean capture, or bioenergy. This is taking CO2 that has already been emitted and absorbing it from ambient air and then putting it into the ground forever. So how does a professional from oil and gas, how can we get into CCUS? Well, it's a lot of the same science. It's a lot of the same skill set. You still need your reservoir engineering, your reservoir modeling, your formation evaluation. You have to understand the geology. You have to understand the system that has kept oil and gas in underground for millions and millions of years. We're looking to do the same, but opposite, by injecting CO2 in the ground forever. you need to drill wells in order to inject the CO2. You need to monitor that the CO2 is staying where you want it to stay. Also requires some project management and field development planning for expansion. And some of the drivers for getting into CCUS is there's a lot of incentive and funding from different governments across different regions of the world. In the US, we see 45Q, which we'll talk about later, but it's a tax credit on a ton basis of CO2. So for every ton that is captured and stored, you can get, $85 for every ton, and I'll touch on the specifics later. There's also significant funding that is going into this space, billions of dollars in North America, in Europe, in Asia. We're seeing schemes develop, especially in the last year, and especially in Asia, and where governments are trying to put the regulatory framework in place in order to support this infrastructure development. There's also a tax where you're penalized for actually emitting. For example, in Europe, there's a cap and trade system where you're capped with the amount of emissions that you can have, and those decrease year over year. So you're actually penalized if you continue emitting. So it's a different kind of incentive. It's almost like a punishment, but it's a different way to get the scale going. So now going a little bit closer to CCUS, looking at the value chain, still bird's eye view, but this is kind of how it breaks up. You first start with your emission, which comes from many industrial sources. There's about 33 gigatons of CO2 that are emitted globally, and this is 2019 levels, so we're a little bit higher today. Those emissions are then captured, and today we're capturing less than 0.2% of the total emissions. Those emissions are then dehydrated and compressed into supercritical state. Supercritical state is a little bit easier to move and a little bit more efficient. You can pack a lot more into the pipelines or into the reservoir. Then it's taken to the storage or utilization point via pipeline or carrier, truck, rail. There's different mechanisms, and I'll go into the different kinds a little bit later. And then of the captured CO2, about less than 1% is going to be put in utilization, different fuels or EOR, and about 99% of that captured CO2 is actually going to be stored permanently. And throughout the life of the field, as I mentioned, we need to monitor the operations and even after operations to make sure that the CO2 is contained where it needs to go. So going into CO2 capture, there's, depending on the type of industry, depending on the type of emitter, that's going to dictate the purity of your stream. And depending on how much CO2 is on your stream will dictate what type of capture you will need. The higher the CO2 content, the easier or cheaper it will be to separate and capture. And there are three types of capture. You have pre-combustion, and which is essentially the almost the purest streams of CO2. It only requires dehydration and compression to move it along. Then you have your post-combustion capture, which will require certain technologies like solvents and sorbents, cryogenic separation, etc. Some of this has already been applied historically and in demonstration projects. So we're still working on getting some of those capture costs down, but it's proven technology. We've been using solvents for decades in oil and gas to separate CO2 from our stream. And lastly, direct air capture, which will include membranes, metal organic frameworks, and different technologies as well. And this is we're talking about ambient air, 400 ppm of CO2 in the air. So you can imagine very low purity, very cost intensive. Now this is kind of an outdated study, but it was done by the Great Plains Institute, and you can see the breakdown in the number of facilities by industry, the amount of CO2 that can be captured, and the estimated cost of capture. To put this study into perspective, the tax credit at the time was about $50 a ton. So if we split the different industries into buckets, we have a market segmentation where the low-hanging fruit are these high purity emitters that only require compression and dehydration. And at the time, industries like cement and chemicals were almost marginal in economics once you accounted for the cost of transportation and sequestration. And these industries really saw a benefit from the expansion of 45Q. Now, for the low purity industries like gas power generation and steel, those would benefit from technology development, like I mentioned before in the capture space. That will drive the total cost down, or by participating in a hub structure in which they would benefit from economies of scale and sharing the infrastructure with other emitters as well. Now, going into transportation, the mechanism by which companies will decide to transport depends on many factors, right? It depends on where your facility is and where your sink or your storage site. And it also depends on your geography. Depending on where you are in the world, will dictate, what you transport your CO2 in. In Europe, for example, a lot of emitters are concentrated on the coasts, and the reservoirs, the storage sinks are going to be offshore, in the North Sea. So it will require perhaps a combination of ship and pipeline. Now, in contrast, in North America, you can see that the emitters are scattered kind of onshore, a little bit of offshore. But the predominant method of transportation there will be pipeline. And you can see kind of the clusters of emitters here. Actually, I believe these are projects. Yeah, these are announced projects. So there's a lot of concentration down here in the Gulf, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But those have pretty optimal geology. So there's big hubs that are being planned down here that many emitters can benefit from. Going a little bit into utilization, this is a big area of research where we're looking for different ways of monetizing CO2 by means of creating a product, a fuel, or a chemical, a building material. The use we're most familiar with, of course, is your enhanced oil recovery, which is the process in which CO2 is injected into a reservoir to displace any remaining hydrocarbons in place and get a boost in production. This has been done for decades, and it's proven to be a profitable avenue to utilize CO2, because under the most recent tax credit in the US, you can get up to $60 a ton of captured anthropogenic CO2 if you use it in EOR, on top of the sale of oil, of incremental oil that you get with your production. So pretty beneficial. Now, going more specific into storage, there are various types of reservoirs in which we can inject CO2. And it includes saline aquifers, it includes coal bed methane, basalts, and also depleted oil and gas reservoirs. The main two that we're going to talk about and that are actually being considered in the market are saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So there's pros and cons for both. Saline aquifers, there's abundant capacity all over the world. These are just reservoirs filled with brine. But of course, we're looking at a pressurized system. So we need to do a proper characterization of not just the reservoir, but the seals and everything around it to make sure that we're not inducing any seismicity or propagating any fractures or activating any faults in the area. Some of the downfalls for saline aquifer injection is that, you know, we have less wells penetrating these types of reservoirs, so we know a little bit less about them. We need to drill our stratigraphic wells to get the properties that we need. But conversely, there are less penetrations into this reservoir, so that minimizes the leakage pathways that could potentially be introduced from legacy wells, which is the opposite case in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. We know these reservoirs very well. We've been producing for many years in some of these. And there are many wells. We have logs, we have core. They're very well characterized and they're proven. We know that they have stored oil and gas for millions of years. So we know that the seal is good. It still requires proper characterization, of course. And then you have the risk of legacy well leakage introduced with the many penetrations if you're going into a field with a lot of legacy wells. You also have deep pressurized systems. So you have to really watch your injection pressure to make sure that you're not introducing Joule-Thomson effect, for example, and jeopardizing well integrity in that case, or going above your fracture pressure, of course. So now going into some of the trapping mechanisms, I mentioned that with depleted oil and gas reservoirs, you have the cap rock. That is your first and predominant trapping mechanism. As you can see on the graph at the bottom, this is at the bottom, you have geologic time, and each color corresponds to each one of the trapping mechanisms. So for the first good chunk of geologic time, you're going to be dependent on that cap rock, on that structural trapping. Then you'll have residual trapping, which is when CO2 goes into the pores, and that's kind of what retains the CO2 from escaping. Then it'll actually dissolve within the brine or within the residual fluid over geologic time, and eventually it'll actually react with the rock that it's surrounded with and mineralize. So this is kind of this is what we need to understand prior to injecting to know that you can contain the CO2 where it needs to be. So let's talk about the storage availability kind of globally. Here in the bottom left map, you can see the distribution of geologic formations across the globe, and each color represents how suitable they are to store CO2. They include all the types of formations that I just covered, including saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs. As you can see, the US alone counts with a large share of storage capacity. And in fact, we count with the most highly suitable capacity in the world, with almost 22 trillion metric tons of capacity. There is way more than enough storage in the US alone to store CO2 for hundreds of years. And for comparison, the UK counts with 22 billion tons of storage capacity. So each point in the map represents emission sources. These are point source emitters from different industries. Some of these emitters are located in suitable geology, as I mentioned earlier. But some of these will actually require there to be a method of transport, like pipeline. A Great Plains Institute study found that the cost of storage is most dependent on the quality of the geology, of course, having a thick injection interval and sufficient overlaying trapping structures, and of course good porosity. So anything that makes a good reservoir for oil and gas, it makes it a good reservoir for CO2 injection. And the other emitters, the ones that are scattered kind of with no suitable geology, they will benefit from CCUS hubs or building a CO2 pipeline by leveraging economies of scale. So in summary, the US has an incredible opportunity to accelerate deployment and scale up with abundant and accessible suitable capacity onshore and offshore, more than enough that what is needed to reach our targets. So a little bit about Baker Hughes and what we do in this space. The company has made several investments in the most innovative capture technology, with technologies such as chilled ammonia process, which is a commercial solvent that is available, direct air capture, metallic organic frameworks, and like I mentioned, part of our business, we actually have the rotating equipment needed to not only take the CO2 into supercritical state, but actually boost it and pump it to where it needs to go. So we count with API compression, also horizontal pumps that are more modular and are more, I would say, a lower lead time. We also have all of our oil and gas capabilities in subsurface analysis, drilling, completions, monitoring and verification. We have experience globally, and we've participated in some of the largest CCUS projects to date, including in Australia and in Canada, for example. A lot of involvement in the US supporting Class 6 permitting applications. And we have many different commercial models in which we can partner with our customers. We can be a general contractor, an integrator of solutions. We can provide in-kind contributions or direct project investment, and also participate as co-recipients of government funding as well. So we have a lot of components that make up the CCUS value chain. And for that reason, we've made a lot of investments, and we've kind of honed into our energy transition goals, and in making several investments to different projects, different groups, making several acquisitions in the space, and developing partnerships, not just in CCUS, but also hydrogen and clean integrated power. So let's bring it back home to the North America market. I'm sure you guys have heard, and I don't really know who all is in the call and how involved you are with CCUS or how much you've heard about it, but there has been significant momentum that has started in the last, I would say, the last 2 to 3 years, but more intensely in the last year. And there's a lot of excitement about it, especially in North America. And some of the drivers are financial incentives, as well as policy and regulatory frameworks. So in 2021, the US passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which allocated $98 billion for energy, and $12 billion of that is specific for CCUS. And the focus is for demonstration projects and deployment. Those funds will be given out in the next 5 to 10 years. Then in 2022, a major act was passed for many things, as you may be aware, but for climate and energy, there were $369 billion allocated for this. This was a bipartisan effort, And the focus was to expand these tax incentives that we had in the US. So as I mentioned earlier, the tax credits had been $50 a ton for permanent sequestration, starting in 2018. If we call back some of the capture costs in some industries, this made some projects marginal at best. It wasn't enough to cover the capture, transportation, and the storage costs that were needed. So this expansion was very significant. Now we're talking about $85 for every ton of CO2 that is captured for permanent sequestration. And then for EOR, it's $60 a ton, which is still it's still pretty good, comparable to oil prices, if you will. And then you have DAC if you pair it with permanent sequestration, now you're getting $180 per ton. Of course, DAC is a lot more expensive, but it moves the needle. We're talking a 3 times increase in this tax credit. And also in recent news, the DOE awarded $444 million to advance 16 US-based carbon storage projects. And this was back in November. And this is not counting all the efforts that the DOE has put out there to demonstrate CO2 storage. They've been doing it for at least a decade, more than a decade, to prove out these projects. So the regulatory frameworks that are in place in the US are world-class. I mean, the US has kind of set the standard for safety in the world. And there are international standards like the ISO 27914 for CCUS, and the European Commission regulations that govern the EU. But in the US, the EPA created the underground injection control, which is there's many classes of injection wells, but they designated a class 6 well specifically for geological sequestration of CO2. And the main objective is to protect underground sources of drinking water. And this framework and these regulations, these requirements are extremely thorough, and the process to get one of these permits approved is very rigorous. You have a thorough site characterization that needs to be done, and the EPA reviews every single piece of this permit application. It includes a reservoir model, a corrective action plan on any existing wells in the area, well construction requirements. There's material concerns, and that the materials by which you're building the wells need to be compatible with the fluids. Obviously, when you combine CO2 and water, it creates a very nasty substance that can be very corrosive. So this is all looked at by the EPA. There's testing and monitoring requirements to make sure that not just is the CO2 staying in place and where you expect it to go, but how's your wellbore integrity? Are you inducing any seismicity? Activating any nearby faults, any corrosion that can be introduced. There's monitoring wells, there's injection wells at different depths, operating requirements, P&A requirements, and so on. This chart, I would encourage everyone to go to the EPA website. They have great resources, not just for operators, but also for the public, and to educate that we're making this as safe as possible. And this diagram shows just that. Every single piece of here, you're talking about the confining layer, we're making sure, and this is not to scale, obviously, there are many layers in the earth that will act as baffles if the CO2 were to escape the primary seal, but for the most part, has been established and characterized and determined to be appropriate for the CO2 that we're injecting. But even if it were to escape, there are many barriers in place. You have seismic tests or seismic surveys that you can run to understand the subsurface a lot more. You have surface microseismic sensors, geophones, to measure the background noises in the reservoir to make sure you're not inducing seismicity, or be able to attribute whether those underground movements are because of your operations, and be able to act accordingly. There's also groundwater monitors to ensure that the potable water, the freshwater aquifers that farmers use for irrigation or personal use, are actually intact and protected. So there are many safeguards in place to ensure that the CO2 is not going anywhere. Now, the primary enforcing authority for these types of wells is the EPA, and the federal EPA is split into different regions to kind of organize themselves and kind of look at the applications for the areas that they oversee. North Dakota and Wyoming received their Class 6 primacy in 2018 and 2020, respectively. And what does primacy mean? Primacy is a state or a territory or a tribe that has full authority to award these types of permits. And a lot of those requirements, the states that have reached primacy have as strict or even stricter requirements than the federal EPA. So the process to obtain primacy is also very rigorous, and only now 3 states have it. Just last month, Louisiana was awarded Class 6 primacy, so they now get to oversee Class 6 permits as well. It took them 2 years to get approved, plus the years before that to prepare the application. So very lengthy process. The EPA really wants to make sure that, you know, everybody is responsible in creating and constructing these types of wells. And then I mentioned the momentum. The Class 6 permit applications have increased exponentially. Just in 2021, there were 12 permit applications that had been submitted to the federal EPA. This doesn't include states with primacy, but there weren't that many then. In 2022, we saw a significant increase to 44. And just last year, we saw a 163% increase in the number of permit applications that were submitted to the EPA. The front runners, of course, Louisiana, they count with some of the best geology for CO2 storage and some of the most capacity. We also know the geology really well through logs and our oil and gas history in the state. Next is California. And I didn't mention this before, but California also has a separate incentive program called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And of course, it's way stricter than the rest of the country when it comes to the fuels and where your fluids come from, and renewables and all of that. But they do provide incentives on top of 45Q for CCUS projects. So they have they're second in place behind Louisiana in number of permits that have been submitted. Then it comes Texas, Illinois, and so on. But as you can see, not a lot have been awarded. There's only 13 active permits in the US today, out of 180 pending in the whole country. So this is another graph that the EPA provides. It's every single line here represents a CCUS project, and it's split by region. of the EPA. So you can see the most permits in Region 6, which is the Gulf Coast, including Texas and Louisiana. So, of course, a lot of these, this is the federal register of Class 6 permit applications. The Louisiana wells or permits will now go into the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources website. As you can see, Wyoming and North Dakota are not here, so they have their own tracker and their own website where they track their projects, but this is at the federal level. And what this does is it gives you a very good perspective into the whole process and the review process and the status of your permit. So you can go to this website, and it's public, and you can see approximately when you should expect your Class 6 permit. You have your completeness review. That's your first stage for your Class 6 permit. Then you have the technical review with it, which is the most lengthy process. And there's a lot of back and forth. Each one of these triangles within the green represents the EPA going back to the operator for more details, questions, clarifications, etc. Once you reach the blue, that's to prepare your draft permit, and you're reaching your public comment period, which is where the public actually gets to comment on how they feel about the project, share the project details, any concerns that they may have. And lastly, the final permit decision is the last piece of it. And then your permit is awarded. This entire process is it's over 2 years long. And that's why there's not a lot of these permits that have been granted, because it's a very thorough process. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the activity. Despite the hurdle of getting your Class 6 permit approved, this does not necessarily hurt the amount of projects that have been announced. There's been a lot of activity recently. You can see in this map, the dots in red are CCUS planned projects. The ones that have a yellow, the red outline and yellow center, those are projects that have submitted a Class 6 permit. And then your blues are your EOR projects. The blue lines obviously are your CO2 pipeline infrastructure. You have a lot in the Permian, of course, because of the EOR market, and then also in Wyoming, also for EOR. Some in North Dakota, some in Oklahoma, and then you can't see it in the Gulf Coast, but this is the Denbury Green Line, also CO2 pipeline. If you just to compare it to the rest of the world, the US is by far leading the way in planned capacity, both for standalone and hub capacity for CO2. And if you divide kind of the map into regions and different areas of interest, if you will, you have the Gulf of Mexico, which is predominantly process emissions, refineries, a lot of power plants. And some of the companies that are pretty active in this space are ExxonMobil, who recently acquired Denbury, and Denbury itself had big plans in the Gulf for CCUS. So by this merger, it actually expands the total CO2 storage capacity by Exxon. There's also Chevron, Talos, Oxy. There's a lot of activity happening down in the Gulf because of the great geology, because of the great capacity that is down there. You have Canada, which I haven't even talked about Canada, but they have introduced a lot of regulatory frameworks as well. They have their own incentive program and like investment credits and also funding, different awards. It's separate from the US, of course, but you have your oil sands emissions, gas processing, power plants, and your different players. In the Midwest, we've recently, there were originally 3 major pipelines planned for the Midwest. As you can see, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of ethanol plants in the Midwest without a lot of great suitable geology. So the plans were to take that CO2 either to North Dakota or to Illinois, in the Mount Simon aquifer. Sorry, that was my dog. But the main one, Navigator Pipeline, with a lot of plant capacity, was actually canceled a few months ago. And then also the Summit Carbon Solution Pipeline was denied their permit, but I think they do plan to resubmit their plans to North Dakota. But all that to say, that doesn't slow the momentum. Those are still low cost CO2 plants that are looking for a sink. So I see those projects continuing, just different forms of storage. So to wrap it up, CCUS presents a business opportunity for oil and gas operators, whether it's with the government funding or tax credits. This is a very promising pathway for the industry to extend the license to operate, to participate in the energy transition, and kind of sustain operations, right? The US is leading the way in CCUS globally. There's bipartisan support at the Capitol. So even with changes in administration, we can expect the momentum to continue for CCUS. The skills that are required for CCUS are transferable from oil and gas for all of the reasons that I've mentioned. It's inherently safe, and there are many bodies, regulatory bodies, overlooking this industry to make sure that it continues to be safe and operations continue to be at the higher standards. It creates jobs, extends the license to operate, like I said, and then also ensures energy security. And a final thought that I want to close with is that the enemy is not the emission. Sorry, backwards. The enemy is the emission. It's not the fuel. Thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions that you guys may have. Appreciate it.
Someone has asked if you can touch on the Oklahoma project, the one going through the middle of it.
Yeah, so these are mainly projects for EOR. There's the ENID, I believe it's ethanol, Coffeyville project. So these are mainly for EOR operations, if that answers the question. I wonder what this one is with a Class 6 permit close to Tulsa. Must not be updated, but it's predominantly for EOR. And I should mention that EOR, it goes through a different process, because when you are injecting CO2 for EOR purposes, you can actually produce some of that CO2. So the well class for the EPA is actually a Class 2, which there's way more Class 2 wells out there, and I think it's a bit quicker to obtain those permits.
Someone said that the one north of Tulsa is captured at Coffeyville, Kansas plant in Burbank oil field.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Someone asked about a copy of the presentation. I will be including Valeria's contact information, and you will request the presentation from her. You guys are free to unmute yourselves, turn on your videos and whatever, and you guys can ask questions too. What requirements dictate Class 6 UIC? I'm aware of a North Texas Class 2 CCUS well.
Yeah, so some of the requirements, like I covered, oh, here you can see the different classes. I didn't touch on the different classes. Class 1 will be for waste disposal, class 2 for EOR, class 3 would be for mining, class 4 for hazardous or radioactive waste, and class 5 is for non-hazardous fluids, with class 6 being specific for geologic sequestration. The requirements, like I mentioned, there are so many parts to this permit. It requires a reservoir model. You need to have a coring plan and logging plan in place, and share all these results with the EPA. And this is why it kind of takes so long, because there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of clarification that the EPA wants from the operator and vice versa. I mean, going specifically into each one, there's a code of federal regulation for the class 6 rule, that you can reference, but this is mainly the summary of the requirements. It's construction, it's testing, is even P&A, financial assurance, um, pre-injection, so baseline monitoring and all of that. I see a question on a depth requirement.
Yes.
There's not necessarily a depth requirement per se, but you nailed it. It has to be far enough from the underground sources of drinking water, and it needs to have that cap rock. So as long as it meets those requirements, you're talking greater than 1,000 feet deep is, I mean, way greater. 1,000 feet deep is where, and I actually just remembered a different requirement, but that's where you can expect 1,000 feet plus. Also, it has to be the reservoir that you inject to, the saline aquifer cannot be deemed as a USDW. So every project needs to look at their geology and see if the reservoir that they're targeting has been labeled as that. I believe it's a total dissolved solid measure to determine whether or not it's a USDW. And I think in Wyoming there's a USDW as deep as 12,000 feet. It's super deep. But that, as long as you're far enough away from an underground source of drinking water, you're good.
How long does it take to secure a class 2 permit for EOR?
That's a good question. And I don't want to make up any numbers, but it's a lot shorter than class 6. I can get back to you with that. But it's probably a few months. There's thousands of class 6 I'm sorry, I'm so used to saying class 6, class 2 permits that have been approved and that are in operation today. So, but you can also convert a class 2 into a class 6, but that is a different process. I don't know the timeline for that, but there's requirements. You have to make sure that your metallurgy is appropriate and all of that. So it would still take a while, even if you went the class 2 route.
All right. If anyone has, wait, here's another one. How will the ability to transport CO2 affect development of CCUS?
It's huge. It's huge. I mean, that's what's going to be the main, where's my slide? The main factor in determining how quickly we can scale CCUS. This map shows a lot of the emitters that are not within suitable geology. So these will require some type of transport mechanism. Canada has a lot of saline aquifer storage, so that they can probably drill a well on site and be good and inject there. But for these, and I'm not showing depleted gas reservoirs here or oil and gas reservoirs, but for saline, you will require pipeline building, but of course that comes with a lot of public, maybe some backlash, not backlash, but drawbacks, or disapprovals, right away considerations and investment, especially. I don't think the recent interest rates have helped the cost at all. So that may have been one of the factors why some of these pipelines were canceled. I don't know, but it'll be critical to build the infrastructure if we want to get to the scale that we need.
All right, if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I'd like to ask about the saline storage. Is that the same type of storage as they store the oil in, the same reservoir, same type of reservoir?
I will say that from a rock perspective, yes, but from a fluid perspective, where you would inject oil and gas would be maybe a depleted oil and gas reservoir, or maybe a salt cavern. But for saline, you have kind of the brine that is in the pores, and it's a pressurized system, so there's pressure management that needs to be taken into account in that as well. Basalt, that's a great topic. There's a lot of research being done in storing into basalt formations. I would not be the best person to answer that question, but I can get back to you on that. I'm not very familiar with that type of injection. There's not a lot of projects today that are planning to inject there.
The next question would be on the continuing cost of storage. You talk about getting the money up front, there's so many dollars per ton, whether it be 60 or 108, what have you, but you'd still have continuing annual operating costs just to put it in there. And once your reservoir is full, there's still going to be a continuing cost thereafter.
Absolutely. And I should mention that these credits have a 12-year window. So once you start injecting, you get $85 for every ton that you inject for 12 years. So what happens after 12 years, we don't know. Those may be extended, or we may be in an environment where those costs are kind of become part of your cost of goods, if you will, and become part of your operational costs. But the main purpose of those incentives, it's to get these projects going in the first place. Thank you for the good comments and great questions.
Awesome. All right, guys, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to Valeria on your own. I have her contact information in the email that I just sent out. Valeria, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to present to us.
My pleasure.
I hope you guys have a great day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, home.